All right, this week we are on the book of Job, which is known as the oldest book in the Bible, one of the very first books ever written. Again, not chronologically, but just one of the oldest books written. It's a sad story. It's a sad story, and it's somewhat kind of confusing. Why do bad things happen to good people? Right? Today we ask ourselves that same question. I get asked that a lot. When there's a tragedy in the world, when there's a tragedy in our own lives, why? And why do bad things happen to good people? I've had some moments in my life that I'll never be able to get out of my head. And I would like to say I could tell you the answer, and I can't. And I don't know if anybody will be able to answer that question of why do bad things happen to good people. Do they happen to good people? Absolutely. Do bad things happen to everybody? Not everybody. It seems like some people don't, but I think sometimes too, that's for our eyes and our perspective. But I remember the very first time that I held a child with a mom and a dad, and handed this child over to the parents and watched them turn off the machine. And to have the parents ask me, why would God allow this to happen? You can't answer that question. And I would like to say, turn to Psalms 32. In that moment like those, you just cry. And you leave there and you ask God, why? God, why did this have to happen? The very first time I saw a kid who was starving, stage 2 malnutrition, where their head and their tummy swell up. And I remember just watching him. And I was there on doing some ministry work, and I remember just thinking, God, why? When I have such abundance, why do kids have to starve to death? Why do kids have to die? Why do divorces have to happen? Why do car wrecks have to occur? God, why is there cancer? God, you could wipe it off the face of this earth just by speaking it, but yet it's still here, and it affects so many lives, and it kills. And we all have that wrestle that we have with God, and we ask him why. And Job did the same thing. And 5 times Job said, God, why? Job lost his 7 sons, his 3 daughters. He was right off the bat, in Job chapter 1, verse 1 says, there is a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless, upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. He was a wealthy man of integrity who loved the Lord, and he feared God. And yet, tragedy struck his family, and then tragedy struck him. And so we get to read this story of this man named Job, and it's in the scriptures, and I in my mind, I have to tell myself maybe that's why it was the first book ever written, because we as Christians had to understand that just because we believe in God and just because we give our lives to God doesn't mean that our lives become easy. Now, we have a sense of hope, we have a sense of faith that the unbelieving world typically can't understand, but we still walk through those struggles, and we don't know the outcome. And just like Job, he didn't know the end of the story. If he would have known this, he wouldn't have had this thing called faith. But yet he said, naked I come into this world, naked I'll go out. Blessed be the name of the Lord. His wife was saying, Job, just curse God and die. He questioned God, why was I not taken from the womb? Why was I not just taken to heaven as a child? Why? He cursed the day he was born. We see that with Moses. Moses did the same thing. Moses said, God, why am I alive? Elijah does the same thing. Both of those 3, Job, Elijah, Moses, all ask God, why was I not taken out of this earth the day I was born? And he struggles with this. Why do these things happen? Job is the first book of the poetry books. So we've covered 17 books of the Bible. Those were talking really about a human race. Talking about a nation, talking about the people. Now we go into the next 5 poetry, which is talking about the human heart. So the first 17 were about a nation, the next 5 are about individuals. And you're going to see in this poetry dealing with individual stories of individual people about the individual's heart. And we just covered the 17 books about the nations, about God's people, about bringing them, redeeming them over and over again. And now we get to look into the heart of men. And so those are the first 17. Now we're in the first 5 dealing with the human heart, these poetic books. The name Job, this story is, a lot of people call it blessing through suffering. I like to think of it as why do godly people suffer? You're going to see this amazing man in chapters 1 through 3. You're going to find his trials and how Satan says, well, of course he worships you because you've given him everything. And God, remember this, always remember this, God had to give Satan permission to tempt him, right? He couldn't just do it. He had to go to God because God, no matter what, is always in control. So Satan had to ask permission. God says, go for it. 1 through 3, you'll see the trials. Chapters 4 through 37. This is where you get Job's buddies, right? The guys coming over. There's 4 of them. 3 of them speak mostly. Then there's one at the end. Elihu is what I call him. I don't know if that's correct or not. And he has a little bit more insight, a little bit more wisdom. But you got these 3 friends, and the 4th come over and they start talking to him. And that's in chapters 4 through chapters 37. And they are going at it in the aspect of, hey, if you're good to God, you're blessed by God. If you're wicked, you're cursed. So Job, you must be wicked. You must be a sin. Job, you need to seek out that sin in your life and ask for forgiveness so you can move on, because God's cursing you because of your wickedness, because of your sin. And so Job is wrestling with these friends of his who are trying to give him advice, trying to tell him why he's being cursed, why bad things are happening to a really, really good person. And I think we can learn a lot from these 4 friends. And we can obviously learn a lot from the scripture, but I think too we need to understand that when theology comes into place on helping humanity, our theology, not just our core beliefs. Understand what I'm saying here, right? But sometimes we put our theology out there instead of human rights, basic needs, in the aspect of, well, I'm not going to help that person because they did this and this. Well, that's your theology. That's not for us to judge. We're not here to judge other people, right? We're here to treat them the way Jesus would treat them. And I think we got to be real careful, just like Job's friends. They kind of let their theology get in place of just saying, hey, Job, let me hug your neck. Let me cry for you. Hey, let me cry with you. Job, this is miserable. I can't believe this is going on. And say, hey, how can we bring you a meal? Can we help you out? How are you and your wife? Instead, they try to throw their theology and say, well, yeah, this is your fault. And I think we have to remember as Christians, it's not our job to, when somebody's going through a suffering time like Job was, to throw out our theology. And so there's a good lesson to be learned with his friends, and not only just his friends, how they spoke to him, but how they spoke to each other. And so you see that through chapters 4 through chapters 37. And then you get to chapter 38. And I know I'm skipping a lot here, okay? So you got a lot in your house church to go back and cover, but this is where it's at for me, okay? When we're going through our trials, when we're going through our suffering, we have to remember something, that God's not obligated to us for an answer. He gave his answer in his Son. He did his part. But here, Job is seeking answers. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this bad happening? And then out of a whirlwind, out of a tornado, however you want to view it in your mind, God spoke. And it starts in chapter 38. And I encourage you, if you got your Bibles in your house church there, open up to chapter 38. And as a house church, just read through chapters 38 through 40. And I know it's going to take a few minutes, but read some of this stuff, right? God is sitting there saying, hey, who shut the sea? Who told the sea where to stop? And then flip over to Jeremiah 5:22, right? Which amazes me. God created creation. He spoke it into existence. And he said, who told the sea you can only go this far? And not only did he stop the raging sea, which if you've ever had a chance to fly over the sea, the ocean, and see how big it really is, and knowing that you're only seeing the top part, you're not seeing anything underneath, and to know that this massive amount of water is stopped and told where to stop by a tiny piece of sand. I want to say, God, you're just showing off. That's impressive. And he's telling Job, hey, who created that? Oh, that's right, I did. Who has a storehouse of snow? Yep, that's me. Who told the mountains, you go this high and you're done? Who spoke creation into existence? And that's what he said. He said, yep, that was me. And read through these, see these, and remind yourself of these. And so when you get to that point where you are suffering or where you're going through tragedy, because that's one of those consistent things that happen to all of us, we're going to go through a valley. It's not if, it's when. And just because you're a Christian, just because you come to house church, just because it doesn't mean you're exempt and that jumps over you. Some point in our life, we deal with death, we deal with suffering, we deal with loss, we deal with tragedy. And so as we deal with that, what a great passage to remind ourselves. Man, I need to think of Job 38. God knows exactly what he's doing, and he's not obligated to answer us. Can we ask God? Yes. Have I asked God? Yes. Have I literally been on my knees crying out to God saying, why, God, why? I have. And did God answer me? Nope. Did I want to answer? You bet. Was God obligated? In the moment, I felt like he was. But that was completely selfish on my part. And I was reminded, he didn't answer Job. He doesn't have to answer me. He doesn't have to give me a reason. Because guess what? He's in control. Right? And so you read that. And then you get over to chapter 40. Chapter 40. Verses 15. Okay? And you know how I stand with creation. You know, I love reading Genesis. I love reading about creation. I love reading about dinosaurs. I think dinosaurs are so cool. And people ask all the time, where are dinosaurs in the Bible? Well, they're in Job. And you put this in context, right? Here Job is struggling. He lost everything. And God is saying, I created the world. I created the snow. I created the waters. I created the mountains. I created everything. Matter of fact, I created the dinosaurs. And he starts laying them off. Behold, behemoth, in chapter 40, verse 15, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an oxen. Behold, his strength is in his loins, his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar tree. That's how we know it's not an elephant, right? It's huge. And you read this and you read his bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He's the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. He's saying, look, he is one of the first of creation. I created that, Job. I made that. I made everything. I put you into existence. Blessed be the name of the Lord, right? And he goes on, and you keep going to chapter 41. So when your kids say, Mommy, Daddy, Grandma, Grandpa, where's dinosaurs at? Right here. Chapter 41, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope around his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you with soft words? This is a dinosaur living in the water. He's saying, hey, you know Leviathan. Can you get a fish hook and go catch him? No. And I made that. And he goes on to tell Job, look, I created everything. And he doesn't give him the answer to the why, but the answer to creation. I'm in charge. So you can read through Job. You see this tragedy of this man who had everything, lost everything, and then at the end, God blessed him again with everything, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't happen. And so we can't assume just because we suffer that God's going to bless us on the other side of suffering. But a few things we learn. One is Satan has no control. He has to answer to God. We learn God's not obligated to answer our questions. We learn that God, he's a creator. He's in charge. He knows the end of the story. When you look at Jesus and you look at what God did, Jesus wasn't plan B. Jesus was the plan. And God knew it. And many times we stop and ask ourselves, God, how are we supposed to reach the ends of the earth? How am I supposed to reach my neighbor? God's like, look, I have a plan. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, right? Jeremiah 29:11. He knows the plans he has for us. He knows what we're supposed to do as Christians. He gave us a job to be obedient, to go teach the world, go teach the lost. And he said, look, I put it all in there. I know what's going on. You just got to do your part. And sometimes we get caught up on the little things. Well, what about this? Or what about this? What about this? And God's like, just go. I got this. So remember that. And then I want to look at a few questions. When you read about Job, you read that he was famous in his culture. One thing he was famous for was his integrity. And so maybe like a little looking at our own hearts. What are we famous for? You're famous. You might not be on TV, but you're famous in somebody's eyes. Probably someone you don't even know. But you're famous for a reason. Is that reason integrity? Or like it says in the very first chapter. Who feared God and turned away from evil. Are we famous for that? Are we famous for something about our kingdom? Second thing. You see this amazing, and it's a faith-filled peace that Job had in the midst of his suffering. Do we have peace in the midst of our storms? I'm reminded when Jesus was on the boat and the storm came brewing and he was sleeping through the storm because he knew he was in control. Job, while it was tragedy and he was suffering, he knew God was still in control. We have to be reminded that God's still in control. And how do we, and maybe the little discussion questions, how do you stay peaceful in the middle of the storm? What does that look for the people in that living room right now? Individually, as a group, with each other, how do you maintain that peace in the storm? And the last thing, I want you to read 1 Peter 3:17. I want you to read that as a group and answer the question this. Answer this question. What is suffering in your life? What does suffering look like in your life? Because I think Job suffered, and we get to reap those benefits of his suffering because we get to read his story. And I think sometimes God calls us to suffer a little bit, and we're really not willing because we want this good life without any suffering in it. Now, when I say suffer a little bit, I'm not necessarily saying that tragedy suffer like he had to deal with death. Sometimes God asks us to suffer a little bit, maybe with our reputation, with our pride, maybe with our finances, maybe with our stuff, maybe with our relationships. And some of that suffering is not bad. But when you read 1 Peter 3:17, what does that mean to you?